Ever wonder why it seems like boys just aren't writing as much these days? Like, what's going on?
Yeah, it's a question a lot of people are asking.
Well, we're going to dive into some analysis today that suggests it might not be about a lack of creativity.
Right.
But maybe more like a culture clash between boys and how we think about writing today.
Interesting.
So we're looking at this piece called How to Get Boys to Love Writing Again.
Okay.
And get this, the piece actually says that boys are creative.
Oh,
they're just expressing it in ways that like traditional writing just isn't catching.
So they're out there creating, just not in the way we might expect.
Exactly.
Fascinating. It's interesting because the source isn't saying boys lack imagination at all.
Right.
What they're exploring is there this disconnect between what boys find engaging and then what's usually celebrated in, say, school or writing competitions?
Makes you think, right? Like we hear all the time about kids glued to screens.
Yeah.
But what if that's actually like a clue to how we can get them excited about writing?
I like that. Yeah, that's one of the big questions we're going to unpack today. But let's start with what the source calls this content gap.
Okay.
It's basically the difference between what boys are consuming, all this media, and what they're being encouraged to create.
Okay, content gap. I like it. Let's break it down. I mean, you think about it. Boys love video games, movies, all that YouTube stuff.
Right.
All this fast-paced visual stuff.
Yeah.
And then we're asking them to, like, write sensitive poetry about, self-discovery or whatever.
And the source is saying, modern fiction, which is important, has become very internal, focused on feelings and introspection.
Right.
And, not that those themes are bad, but
sure.
They're just not hitting the same way for boys as like, a dystopian thriller.
Yeah.
Or like story about, I don't know, hacking into the CIA mainframe or something like that.
Exactly. So, I mean, are boys just like hardwired for different stories? Is it nature? Is it nurture?
It's a good question.
Or are we just missing the mark on what they actually like?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
And it has big implications.
Yeah.
I mean, what happens if a whole generation of boys just doesn't connect with, traditional storytelling?
That's a good point.
Yeah.
And speaking of things that maybe aren't connecting, the source goes after school writing competitions.
Oh, yeah.
It's saying they're not just like a little out of touch, but maybe even pushing boys further away from writing.
Interesting. What's interesting here is it's not just saying these competitions are boring.
Right.
It gets specific.
Yeah.
Like it claims the type of writing that wins often feels really dated, super focused on good messages.
Okay.
And just totally out of sync with how boys actually joke around.
Yeah, like they literally mention winning entries about the like complexities of vegan cooking.
Oh, wow.
It's like, how is a 14-year-old boy supposed to relate to that?
That's a good point.
Yeah.
And that leads to something else the source brings up.
Right. Yeah.
This idea of a perceived feminization of writing spaces. Now, before anybody jumps to conclusions,
right.
This isn't saying women are the problem or anything like that.
Yeah, of course not.
It's more about acknowledging that different genders might just have different perspectives, different senses of humor.
Totally. Like what one person finds profound, another might find totally cheesy.
Exactly. And the source argues that this difference in perspective might actually be playing out in these competitions. So if the majority of judges are women, are they even subconsciously favoring writing that aligns with their own experience, their own taste?
It's a really tricky question, but it's one we gotta ask, right?
We do.
Because if we're accidentally pushing boys away from these spaces, where are they supposed to go?
Yeah.
What happens to, their creative voices?
And here's where things get really interesting. The source argues that boys are finding outlets for their creativity. They're just not the ones we might expect.
Oh, yeah. Things are about to get a little weird, I think.
Okay, good.
Remember that wizard sleeve anecdote I mentioned?
Oh, yeah.
Well, buckle up, because we're about to dive into the world of boys' humor, and it's not always pretty.
Let's do it. Well, pretty isn't really the point, right? The source is saying boys are drawn to humor that, pushes boundaries, that embraces the absurd, the edgy, even stuff some people would call, like, grotesque,
Yeah, it's like they're looking for that shock factor, that element of like rebellion. You know what I mean?
I get it.
And speaking of shocking, you ready for the wizard sleeve?
Oh, yeah. Let's hear it.
Okay, so the source talks about this conversation between a group of boys.
Okay.
And they're talking about this woman.
Yeah.
Who's trying to, well, let's just say break a record.
Right.
In a rather intimate way.
Okay, this is going to be good.
It involves a lot of men in a very short amount of time.
Oh, my.
And afterwards, one of the boys describes the look on her face as like a wizard's sleeve.
A wizard's sleeve.
Yeah, I know. It's completely bizarre.
Yeah, that's
But it's the kind of humor we're talking about.
wow. Definitely not your typical prize-winning prose.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it is kind of hilarious in its absurdity.
It is. And it highlights something important the source talks about.
Okay.
This idea that boys' humor, like, it often goes to these dark, surreal places.
Yeah.
And it makes you think, like, how do we as adults even approach this?
Right.
On the one hand, you want to encourage creativity.
Of course.
Even if it's a little offbeat, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, we got to set some boundaries.
Right.
Like, where's the line between a creative expression and just being inappropriate?
That's the constant struggle, right?
It is.
Yeah.
And it's even more complicated when you think about these writing competitions.
Yeah.
Because, like, who is deciding what crosses the line? And that ties back to the source's point about those judging panels. It's not about saying women are bad judges or anything like that.
Right.
But maybe, having such a homogenous group evaluating these entries
Yeah.
isn't giving boys a fair shake.
Think about it. If you've got a panel of judges
Right.
who are mostly drawn to, like, introspective, emotionally driven writing, are they really going to get a story
Right.
that's full of dark humor and weird, absurdist imagery?
Probably not. And that could lead to, boys feeling like their style of writing is just wrong or not good enough.
Right.
Which is a shame because, like the source points out, humor, satire, even those grotesque elements can be really sophisticated and thought-provoking,
It's true.
It's like we're saying, you can be creative, but only in this little box.
Right.
And that's not really fostering true creative expression.
No, it's not.
It feels more like we're putting kids in a box.
To-
And that leads to another big question the source brings up.
Okay.
What happens when boys feel like,
Yeah.
their creative voices aren't being heard?
Yeah. Where do they go?
Where do they go? Well, I mean, in today's world,
Right.
they've got options that they can go online,
Yeah.
create their own content,
Right.
build their own audiences.
It's like the whole landscape of storytelling is changing.
Yeah, it really is. So are we losing something if boys are turning away from traditional writing? Or are we just seeing, like, the birth of something new, something that speaks to their generation in a way that, like, stuffy old writing competitions just can't?
It's an interesting question.
Right.
And it actually ties back to something the source mentions
Okay.
about how some judges really need to, and I'm quoting here,
Yeah.
get their heads around the idea that material needn't have emotional stakes,
Yeah.
arcs of self-discovery and themes of identity in order to be sophisticated.
Yeah, it's almost like we've become so obsessed with these very specific,
Right.
like, elements of storytelling
Yeah.
that we've forgotten that other forms of writing
Uh-huh.
can be just as valid, just as insightful, just as sophisticated.
Totally.
Right.
And, what's really fascinating to me is that this whole discussion about boys and writing, it actually brings up broader questions about how we even define creativity.
Oh, totally. Like, are we limiting ourselves by sticking to these narrow definitions of what good writing is supposed to look like?
Exactly. And are we missing out
Yeah.
on a whole world of creative potential because we're so focused on, like, ticking boxes?
That's a good point.
Yeah.
And what about humor, right?
Oh, yeah.
The source talks about how humor can be such a powerful tool for exploring complex ideas, for challenging norm, for making sense of the world. But it feels like we've become almost, like, afraid of humor.
Yeah, especially in schools.
Especially in schools. Yeah, like, we've sanitized creativity,
Yeah.
Sucked all the fun out of it.
Maybe that's why boys are, like, turning away from these traditional writing spaces.
Yeah, maybe.
They're looking for places where they could be themselves, experiment, push those boundaries without being judged, without being censored,
So where does all this leave us? Well, the source offers a few solutions.
Okay.
Like more diversity in judging panels.
Right.
Having people who can actually appreciate different kinds of humor, different kinds of stories.
Different perspectives.
Different perspectives,
Yeah.
exactly. A greater willingness to embrace, a wider range of...
Sure.
And a recognition that, like, sophistication doesn't always have to be a heartfelt coming-of-age story,
Right. It's about expanding what good writing can be.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Can a story about a zombie apocalypse be just as insightful as a story about a first love? Can something that makes you laugh out loud also think?
Good questions.
The source seems to think so. And I'm kind of inclined to agree. It's like we've forgotten that writing can be fun.
Yeah.
It can be subversive. It can be totally bonkers. And maybe that's what we need to bring back to get boys excited about writing again.
It could be.
Right.
So where does this leave us? Well, the source ends on a pretty thought-provoking question.
Okay.
If boys are turning away from traditional writing and finding other ways to be creative, what happens to the future of literature?
It's a good question, right? Will traditional writing just become this thing that only appeals to a very specific audience? Is that a bad thing?
Right.
Or is it just evolution? Like, are we seeing new forms of storytelling emerge that speak to this generation in a way that traditional writing just doesn't?
It's a fascinating debate.
It is.
And there are no easy answers,
Right.
But we do know one thing.
What's that?
We can't ignore boys' voices in this conversation.
Absolutely.
We need to listen to their concerns, understand their interests, create spaces where they feel comfortable expressing themselves authentically, even if it doesn't fit our ideas of what good writing is.
Exactly. Even if it's a little weird. Right.
Exactly. Because who knows? Maybe those wizard sleeves hold the key to a whole new kind of literary brilliance. One that's raw, unexpected, and full of surprises.
Yeah. This deep dive has definitely given us a lot to think about.
It has.
What stands out to you from all of this?
It's a good question.
It's one thing to talk about this stuff theory.
Right.
But the source actually gives some real examples from writing competitions.
Oh, interesting.
And it really shows this disconnect with what boys might like.
Yeah, I think seeing those examples makes it more real.
So they talk about a bunch of different competitions, and there's this pattern.
Okay.
Lots of the winning entries are about identity, especially LGBTQ plus experiences, coming of age stories, social justice stuff.
Right. All important topics, of course.
Yeah, totally.
But the source asks this question.
Yeah.
Are those the only themes worth celebrating?
Right. Exactly.
Are we maybe, without even realizing it, favoring some kinds of stories over others?
And here's where it gets tricky.
Okay.
Because the source is pretty blunt. It says a lot of boys just hate this focus on identity politics.
Oh, wow.
They see it as preachy, not relatable, just not cool.
Yeah, that's a strong statement for sure.
It is.
And it's important to say this isn't about, dismissing those themes.
Right, right.
Or saying they shouldn't be in writing.
Of course.
But it does make you wonder, are we missing a big part of the audience?
Yeah, imagine you're a 15-year-old boy into dark humor, sci-fi, maybe a little horror, and you see these competitions praising stories about, self-discovery, and you think, where do I fit in?
This isn't for me.
Exactly. Yeah, and he might start to feel like his interests are wrong somehow.
Right, or not as good.
Yeah, and that's not good, especially for kids who are still figuring themselves out.
I agree.
So, what do? The source says we need a few things.
Okay.
More diversity on those judging panels.
Makes sense.
So you have people who get different types of humor, different stories.
Yeah, different perspectives.
Right, and a willingness to be open to a bigger range of themes. And realizing that being sophisticated doesn't always mean a heartfelt coming of age.
It's about opening up what good writing can be.
Totally.
Can a zombie apocalypse story be just as insightful as a first love story?
Right.
Can something make you laugh and make you think?
I think so.
Me too.
It's we forgot that writing can be fun. It can be a little subversive. It can be totally out there.
It can.
And maybe that's the key to getting boys excited about it again.
Interesting.
So where does all this leave us? Well, the source ends with this big question. If boys are moving away from traditional writing, finding other creative outlets, what does that mean for the future of, literature itself?
That's a big one.
Yeah. Will traditional writing just become this niche thing? Is that bad? Or is it just how things change?
Right.
Are we seeing new kinds of storytelling that speak to this generation better?
It's a fascinating debate.
It really is. And there's no easy answer.
Yeah. But we can't ignore what boys are saying. Right. We got to listen to them, understand what they're into, create spaces where they're comfortable being themselves, even if it doesn't fit our ideas of good writing.
Exactly. Even if it's a little out there.
Exactly.
Right.
Who knows? Maybe those wizard sleeves have the key to some whole new kind of brilliance.
Yeah.
Something raw, unexpected, full of surprise.
Well, this deep dive has definitely given us a lot to think about.
It really has.
What are your takeaways? What stands out to you?
Well, for me, I think the biggest thing is just remembering that creativity can take so many forms.
It can.
And we need to be open to that, especially when it comes to young people.
Absolutely.
We don't want to stifle their imaginations.
Yeah.
by forcing them into boxes that don't fit.
Exactly. We want them to explore, experiment, find their own voices.
Exactly. And who knows what amazing things they'll create.
That's what I'm hoping for.
Me too.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today's deep dive.
It flew by.
It did.
Lots to think about.
There is, but we'd love to hear your thoughts, too.
Yes, absolutely.
Have you noticed these trends?
Yeah.
What are your experiences with boys and writing, either personally or with young people you know?
Share your thought. Keep the conversation going.
And remember, this is just one perspective.
Just one.
There's always more to explore, more deep dives to come.
There are.
So stay curious, keep those imaginations firing, and don't be afraid to embrace those wizards sleep.
I love that.
Until next time.
Yeah.